This is Lynette Fraga, Executive Director here at Child Care Aware of America, and I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining today's presentation. Today's webinar, Raise Quality, Early Childhood and Quality Rating and Improvement Systems, is the third in our Raise Your Hand webinar series. Child Care Aware of America's Raise Your Hand series is a 5-month campaign to help shape the ongoing national conversation around various opportunities that enrich the state of child care and early education in this country. This series was created with the intent to raise awareness about federal and state early learning opportunities that support child care, connect participants with content experts, and inspire all who care about early learning to take action to better the lives of working families. Today's presentation on early childhood and QRIS will be presented by Gerrit Westervelt, Executive Director of the BUILD Initiative and its QRIS National Learning Network. Gerrit has had a distinguished career with more than 23 years as an education policy leader, providing technical assistance and consulting services to governors, legislators, foundation executives, and other national and state local leaders. Prior to joining BUILD, Gerrit served as the president of QualStar Early Learning, providing quality ratings, improvement strategies, and parental support for early childhood across his home state of Colorado. Before I turn it over to Gerrit, I want to point your attention to the question box function, which should be located on the right side of your screen. Please use this function to make a comment or ask questions, and Michelle Noth-McCready on my staff will be sure to field those questions during the course of the webinar. If you have more general questions or comments, please submit those at the conclusion of the webinar via the question box function. Thank you. Without further delay, I will now turn it over to Gerrit Westervelt. Gerrit?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lynette, and thank you to Child Care Aware of America for inviting me to be a part of this conversation with you today. As I understand it, we're going to try to leave as much time as we can for questions at the end of this. So I'm going to probably go fairly quickly through. I think it's about 16 slides and talk about QRIS and systems development and the role of CCR&R in that process, and would love to get into as much of a discussion as we can get in on these within the constraints of our technology. So let me just jump in and I'll try to move quickly through, and would love folks to use the chat function and submit as many questions as you'd like to. First, just a moment about the BUILD initiative. BUILD is an initiative of a group called the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative. It was created a decade ago by a consortium of foundations concerned with early childhood who wanted to work on systems building, on trying to connect and align all the different pieces of early care and education, child health, family support, special needs programming. We provide services through our meetings and events and webinars and technical assistance activities to all 50 states, and then we have 10 states that we work with more intensively, providing more intensive TA and financial support as well. And a few years ago, BUILD started the QRIS National Learning Network as kind of a cross-state learning community to provide a forum for QRIS leaders to share ideas and best practices. And really what we wanted to do is provide tailored technical assistance and knowledge building to help states refine and scale up effective quality rating and improvement systems. And over the last few years, along with our partners, the Federal Quality Center, the Professional Development Workforce Center, Child Trends, Frank Porter Graham, a number of other organizations, we've done more than 75 web-based and in-person meetings and TA activities around QRIS. Debbie Mathias, who used to run the system in Pennsylvania, is the director of the QRIS National Learning Network project. One of the central focuses of that work has been the idea that QRIS should focus on the I, should focus on the improvement part of QRIS even more than the rating part, and also that QRIS can serve as an organizing framework for overall systems change, which is really the business that BUILD is in. So that's really what I'd like to talk about today, how QRIS are evolving
Gerrit, are you still there? I'm sorry, we're having a couple of audio issues here. Please give us a moment to try and address the situation.
I just got a note that said I've been disconnected.
You're back on.
You're back on now.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
And your screen, if you can just show your screen. I think you still have access as a presenter. Actually, I'm going to do that now. And if you just click OK to show your screen and accept the presenter role, which you see. Okay, great. You can see your screen now.
All right, you're back in business.
All right. Am I back?
Yep.
It was very humiliating to be told that I had been deleted from the webinar. I thought that's terrible. What did I do? Anyway, I apologize for the technical difficulties. So, really, the way we look at QRIS is really through kind of three lenses. That as a system lever, it can be used as a yardstick to enable both public officials and agencies and private funders to assess the effectiveness of their investments in early care and education programs. A fundamental reason for implementing QRIS, as everyone knows, is as a driver of quality improvement. To really show states where gaps in quality exist and what kind of resources are needed to improve quality. And one of the things that I'd love to talk about at the end is the both level and type of resources that really are needed to move the quality needle. And then finally, as a systems tool, QRIS are being used to very slowly and haltingly, but steadily, to align different program, teacher, and child standards and the funding and professional development systems that are needed to support them. So here is this is actually from August, so it's a few months old, but an overview of where states are in the planning, piloting, fully implementing stage. Every time I show this map, someone says, "Wait a second, we're not orange, we're supposed to be blue, or we're supposed to be something else." So it's changed greatly in the last couple of years, and certainly even in the last 6 months. States are in various stages. Some are piloting but don't really have sufficient funds to implement. Obviously, the Early Learning Challenge states, now 14 but soon to be probably closer to 20, are moving very quickly to develop or revise their quality rating and improvement systems, to integrate them with licensing, which is a whole other kettle of fish, as you know. And even states without Race to the Top are using the plans and strategies that they created under that proposal process to move ahead with their QRIS. But what we have now is a landscape policy-wise in which QRIS, for better or worse, are driving, or at least are central to, major policy goals and strategies that state governments and also private funders are using to drive systems change. So let's talk a little bit about why do this in the first place. From a consumer and family perspective, I think this is where our practice really has yet to catch up with our theory. We just really aren't far enough along on this front to say whether the whole market-based model actually works. I mean, as many of you know, empowering parents with information and enabling them to make an informed choice and eventually, hopefully, to have the resources to buy quality care is intended to both drive the supply and the demand side of the early care and education marketplace. Now, does QRIS enable parents to demand quality, and does it really drive the market toward high quality care? I would argue that no, at this point it does not, but that's one of the things we should talk about is whether that model of supply and demand, QRIS as a market-based intervention, is on track to work, and what could be done to make that work more effectively so that we don't drive parents out of the market. I mean, the cost of high-quality programs often makes the best programs out of reach financially for middle and low-income families, and you really need a critical mass of participation before any kind of public engagement or awareness campaign focused on quality can really begin to drive the market. And then secondly, from a program or provider perspective, this has been seen across states as both a positive or a negative. In some cases, providers have seen this as a threat to their livelihood, that it's going to cause their costs to increase, it's going to cause a very delicate financial balance that they've been trying to maintain to be upset. And one of the lessons that we've seen in the QRIS states so far, if we want to avoid a backlash and really causing harm to providers, is the need to fully engage and empower providers in creating the standards and really setting up good productive communications loops so that providers have a voice in the process. And then another real key, of course, and this is the big question mark that I've heard from a lot of providers, is how do you have sufficient supports and clear pathways for improvement so that the pay for providers and teachers, grants for facility improvements, TA and coaching can all be of sufficient depth and availability that providers can actually attain the standards that are being laid out for them. And so states are in the process across the country of trying to revise and streamline the QI part of the work so that the supports and the resources can begin to catch up with the needs to improve quality. And then finally, from a policymaker or a funder perspective, you know, policymakers, any kind of investor wants accountability for the programs they're funding. State governments obviously want to maximize the use of dollars in the subsidy system. And I guess my editorial comment on that piece is, it seems to me that for too long we've been playing defense. The early care and education field has been sometimes on the defensive and under attack for poor quality, and we haven't really made a compelling case that it's the underfunding of the system and the lack of resources that's really made it difficult for us to demonstrate our value. And it seems to me that QRIS provides us with an opportunity to go on offense a little bit and make the case that our poorest kids are too often in the poorest care, and that if school reformers in K-12 and economic development, you know, governors and others that are concerned with economic progress really want to succeed, that we need to invest in young kids and invest in the ECE system in order to make that happen. So the historical context of this, and this won't be news to many of you that have been in the field for a long time, but you know, childcare has really evolved from a work support to a vehicle for school readiness. Policymakers really, you know, a decade, 15 years ago, began to really think in earnest about how they could impact such a large and diverse system with multiple funding streams and multiple jurisdictions and governance structures. And it became very clear 15 years ago that childcare needed to continue to improve in quality and become a stronger partner as state pre-K, Head Start continued to march, and so the expectations and the I guess the political burdens on the ECE system have generally grown faster than the funding, and hopefully QRIS is one tool to change that equation. And at the same time, all of the neuroscience and brain research that has come out over the last 10 or 15 years has continued to gain some public attention. Seems like we have a magazine cover every couple of years with a wide-eyed baby on it, and a story about how important the early years are. And what we have to do is figure out politically how to capitalize on the brain research and turn that into funding. The federal government historically has focused on subsidy and has only recently spent more time and attention thinking about early learning standards, professional development standards, and program standards. And the Early Learning Challenge has certainly put both the focus on quality and the focus on systems building front and center. As many of you know, and probably some of you were involved in, the Administration for Children and Families, the Office of Child Care, created 2 or 3 years ago a draft set of benchmarks for QRIS, which are still very drafty and advisory, but are increasingly being seen, I think, within some circles in DC as a good start toward defining what a good QRIS needs to have. And so we're shifting to this whole standards-based paradigm, and as many of you know, there's a lot of anxiety out in the system about the pros and cons of shifting to a standards-based model. We've seen K-12 make that shift and end up with a lot of accountability in testing and not always the money that's needed to succeed in that system. So what we need is to continue to push for the resources to match the higher standards and to get better alignment and synergy among these different sets of standards. And so we've now moved to a point where, with Race to the Top, that systems building is now really the dominant frame for early childhood policy. And I think for CCR&R, one of the key questions is, what's our role in systems building? How do we talk about it? How do we connect what we do to the idea of creating comprehensive early learning systems for kids? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the principal elements of quality. You guys all know that better than I do. But I think that the main point I would make is that QRIS really should be viewed as a continuous quality improvement effort. And so it's sort of QRIS leaders and developers and implementers are trying to engage in continuous quality improvement themselves and learning and developing and refining their QRIS as they go forward. It's not a research project. It's not a program level intervention as much as it is an overall systems level intervention. And the goal is to help programs engage in continuous improvement. A lot of attention, in my opinion, has been focused on measurement and on the limitations of measures that are used in QRIS, and discussions about environmental rating scales versus class or both, and how well these measures actually measure critical components of quality. I think some of that debate is absolutely necessary, and I don't want to at all imply that we don't need to be rigorous and thoughtful about the measures that we use, but I think that less attention has been paid to the I in QRIS, and we need to be thinking about what works, very intentionally thinking about what works to actually help providers get up the scale and what kind of resources are needed in different contexts to move up the ladder. So elements of QRIS, as doubtless you've seen versions of this chart elsewhere before, program, teacher, and learning standards, rating and monitoring, which can include self-assessment at lower levels, independent monitoring and observational tools with valid and reliable tools at higher levels. Increasingly, everything has moved, of course, online, and increasing reliance on self-assessment, which raises its own set of methodological questions. Financial incentives is a big, I guess, kind of question mark. It's expensive to work on quality. state leaders, at least the ones that I've been working with, have asked a lot, how can I leverage and align all the funding in the system to really provide sufficient incentives for providers to improve quality. And they're trying tiered reimbursement, wages programs, bonuses, tax incentives, college savings accounts, professional development accounts. So they're really working on trying to make sure that the QI, the incentives and the QI supports are adequate. No one, I think, would argue that we're anything close to being as sufficient as we need to be. And then finally, I mean, thinking about parent and consumer education as a key part of this. It's hard to engage parents in a discussion about quality if we can't very easily and simply define it and talk about it. But we also can't really ask parents, try to get parents to make different buying choices unless we've really made it easy for them to understand the system and we've made it easy for providers to get into the system. So I just want to touch very briefly. I know we have some folks from Virginia on the webinar, and would love to get your comments about the system. But I wanted to just highlight Virginia's QRIS, the Star Quality Initiative, because it's a good example, one of many examples of a public-private partnership, and it's administered as part of an umbrella organization, the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, which has a number of different supporting initiatives connected to it, but it's spread across the state very quickly just in the last few years. And there's the Smart Beginnings Network, a statewide network of collaborative partnerships. It's been brought together. A significant amount of private money has been raised. So it's a good model of a public-private way of getting a QRIS to move forward. And then I just wanted to mention California. I mean, it's an interesting model to me because on the one hand I see the wisdom in moving to multiple systems with a great deal of local control and local discretion. California is spending the vast majority of its Early Learning Challenge funding to support 17 regional leadership consortia that all have agreed to align their locally developed QRIS to a quality continuum framework and have agreed to certain parameters using that framework, but there is no one statewide system. And so it'll be, I mention it because it'll be interesting to see how well this very locally driven model of QRIS plays out as it goes to scale. Will it end up being you know, a hodgepodge of disconnected standards and quality, or will the quality continuum framework, they've developed this matrix and they're measuring all the typical stuff, but how well will that system come together as it goes to scale and moves forward? I just want to make the point here about driving continuous quality improvement. I think CCR&Rs are really well positioned to play a key role. Nobody else knows parents and providers and early care and education inside and out the way CCR&Rs do. And I think the question that I have is, who has the capacity to drive and support continuous quality improvement at the program level? And if CCR&Rs in a given region or location don't have that capacity, to what extent can that be changed, and what resources are really needed, and what can we deliver with the resources that we have, and how can CCR&Rs leverage the vast knowledge and connections and relationships that you have within the system to play a key role in driving quality improvement. And then I also just want to touch very briefly on the issue of race, culture, and language. 20 states referenced in their Early Learning Challenge proposals, the inclusion of specific measures related to cultural competence. You know, a number of states propose to develop specific materials in multiple languages. In a lot of people's view, we haven't even begun to go far enough. I really think it's an Achilles heel of the whole QRIS movement that I have been, you know, and am a proponent of overall. But I think when we asked Charlie Bruner, our evaluator from the Child and Family Policy Center in Iowa a few years ago, and he wrote a policy brief on it. It's on the buildinitiative.org website, and probably on the QRIS network.org website as well. We asked Charlie to look at this program standards in a number of different QRISs, and he didn't find a single one that would be thought of reasonably as culturally responsive. And I think this puts the entire quality movement at risk, because if we end up only improving quality for certain families and really continue to adequately serve others, if we don't attract and serve poor and minority kids well in these systems and their outcomes don't improve, it's going to make it that much harder to make the political and financial case that we need to make for the system as a whole. So I think it's something that everyone is sincere about wanting to make progress on, but we really, really, really need to focus on how these systems can be made more culturally relevant for all families, because I think it really risks undermining the overall political case that we're trying to make. So anyway, sort of final couple of thoughts. It really needs to be seen as a framework for quality improvement and systems building, and not a program intervention. We're attempting to get clearer and clearer about what the outcomes are and to try to get away from this kind of relentless focus on child outcomes. QRIS haven't really been able to show a direct link to child outcomes, which doesn't surprise me, because quality rating and improvement systems are not as close to the child as they need to be. Providers are close to children. But I do think that other key outcomes are driven by QRIS. And those outcomes might include the professionalization of the workforce, the system alignment piece that we've talked about, you know, encouraging clear linkages between PD and early learning standards, and enhancing family outcomes that in theory, as more and more programs are rated and getting quality improvement resources, parents' understanding of how to support their child's development and their work-family life balance will be improved as well. I think where we're moving is into an era where we're going to be continuing to look very hard at which standards are related directly and indirectly or not to child outcomes. And maybe we're not weighting the right stuff or weighting sufficiently the variables that are most closely and directly related to child outcomes. There are, for example, very few standards related to curriculum and assessment intentionally, because QRIS were designed to work in all different types of settings. But you know, curriculum and instructional practices are certainly directly related to child outcomes, and perhaps we need to pay more attention to those. Then the other point I think I want to make is that as we've watched QRIS evolve and be implemented across the country, you know, we are seeing increasing provider participation over time, and we're seeing, again, a great need to have adequate resources and supports to move people up the quality continuum. We're seeing better use of data and cross-system databases. The clunky QRIS systems of 7 or 8 years ago have rapidly been replaced with more robust data systems. I think Race to the Top is really helping that as well. Assessment tools, you know, an ongoing conversation. In my mind, we've spent a little too much time and energy and political capital arguing about measures, and not enough arguing about what we really need in terms of supports and incentives and money. States like Massachusetts have taken a hard look at whether they need to add additional standards versus streamlining them and reducing duplication. Integration with licensing is a piece related to that. And as these quality improvement initiatives expand, related to QRIS, we need to look at the question of adequacy. It's always bothered me that we can say to a provider, okay, jump through these hoops and you'll get support, and we'll find out through the rating process that a given provider, let's say, needs $3,000 a classroom for 4 classrooms in materials, books, and curriculum and training, and higher ed scholarships, and then we end up giving them $1,500 or a $1,000 one-time grant, and then ask them why they haven't adequately improved. So we need to look at the adequacy of the funding that's being provided. We're definitely seeing greater alignment across different types of ECE. And again, there's a lot of good arguments to be had about the pros and cons of that alignment: pre-K and Head Start, and child care, center-based and family-based. But it's certainly making it easier for funders and policymakers to get their heads around this complicated system. We're seeing more attention to interventions, to QI investments that are really focused on children's readiness. And also a number of states are looking at leadership, and I should mention shared services in that as well, because that's, although I've argued with my good friend Louise Stoney and others that shared services is a lousy brand for what it does, helping to improve the business practices as part of an overall quality effort is certainly something that's worth looking at. And then the last thing I'd really want to say is that there's research that Marty Zaslow and Catherine Tout at Child Trends and others have done that really suggests that QI efforts need to be targeted at specific kinds of interactions and features of quality. Coaching is a big part of that, but they need to be sufficiently well designed and well specified so that they can be really, coaching models can be implemented with fidelity. And then the second bullet is kind of interesting. That my argument is that we need to, and I think people are starting to pay closer attention to levels of the system and phases of implementation. So the idea there is that something, let's say a particular QI intervention, or the way you're measuring one of the structural or process quality pieces that your QRIS is measuring, something may work very well at one level of the system, like the state. The state may be getting what it wants, but it may not be working at another level, like the classroom or the setting. And so instead of arguing about whether a piece of the QRIS is good or bad, we should be arguing about who it's good and bad for. And also phases of implementation. Maybe something is rocky at the beginning. Are you listening, healthcare reform? But maybe later on, when some of the kinks have been worked out, may have a different perception and a different level of effectiveness. I think what we're moving toward overall is, we've got increasing political momentum for early childhood systems building, for quality overall, and for the importance of investment in young kids, and we need to be able to take advantage of that. And then I want to conclude with a couple of questions specific to child care resource and referral specifically. So who do you love? What I mean by that is, in recent years, I've seen a lot of R&Rs, different types of R&Rs, really having to serve a lot of different constituencies and having very conflicting political pressures and loyalties on them. They've got loyalties to providers, to parents, to the state agencies that provide them funding. And I think the question is, how do you know whether you have the right balance of attention and loyalty and focus of your energy toward your different constituencies? I have seen some R&Rs that have been so provider-centric that they've really haven't seemed as focused on parents. I've seen others that come across as really focused on parents and not really as close to or supportive of providers as they might be. And then obviously, you know better than anybody, the relationships with state agencies can sometimes be fabulous and sometimes be really problematic. how much related to that sort of what's your focus and who are you focused on is to what extent are you really in the quality business, and who knows that? One of the things I've said to Lynette is that even the brand Child Care Resource and Referral needs to be looked at in the context of the quality movement. I think that it's been difficult for CCR&Rs to gain traction politically in some places because policymakers don't really get it, and they don't really see why resource and referral, they don't really understand what resource means, and they don't necessarily see the need for referral services as clearly as they should. And then the third point is about outcomes. We need to have a conversation. I think that CCR&R have a lot to offer on this front about what outcomes we really care about and how well our QRISs are measuring them. I mean, as I alluded to in those earlier slides, yes, it's about school readiness, but professionalization and improvement of the early childhood workforce is a worthy goal in and of itself for a number of different reasons. And if we're measuring that, we should be clear about how we're measuring that and what incentives are attached to that. What is the value of enhancing family outcomes, like a parent's ability to nurture their children? How valuable is having better work-life balance and less stressed out parents who are able to pay more attention to the needs of their kids? If those are things that we value, how can we measure them better and connect financial resources to them? And then who and what are you connecting? I mean, I really think systems work is really about intersections. It's about linkages and connections among and across people and systems. It's less about programs, and I think at least there's a perception that R&Rs have often been about programs and and about supporting early childhood providers, and that's all well and good, but I think since systems is sort of the framework for policy making at this point, it may be that Child Care Resource and Referral needs to be clearer about the role that they're playing in promoting systems development and the assets that CCR&R has to offer. And if CCR&Rs are playing a key role in connecting professional development and program standards and curricula and parents and providers and educating the general public, I think that's something that you really need to let people know about. And I think that I want to compliment Lynette and her staff for doing a great job of really stepping out on that front and raising the profile of the field and of CCR&R in general. And there's so much great work going on. Child Care Resource and Referral agencies have been key players in the quality movement from the beginning, and I think it's really important and great that CCAA is doing a lot to increase the profile and the visibility. So with that, I will shut up and hope that I don't get booted off the webinar again, and maybe we can get some questions. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerrit. That was a really wonderful overview of a continuous quality improvement effort and questions to the field that CCR&Rs and users of QRIS systems are grappling with. So thank you for that. So if you have your chat box, Gerrit, you can follow along. I'll read the questions that folks have for you, and then if you can provide the answers, that would be great. Okay, so we have the first question that's coming in is what models are most states adopting? And does the state work directly with CCR&Rs, or is there typically a middle agency managing the contracts with the CCR&Rs for QRIS?
Well, I mean, the best answer, it's really hard to generalize. Each state manages it differently. I think, a number of states have state-level intermediary organizations, like the Virginia example. California has a number of intermediary organizations. I think that one of the trends that we've definitely seen is greater assertiveness and ownership on the part of state departments of human services. So state child care administrators are kind of owning this more, and in many cases. And so, as a general statement, I would argue that those state agencies are even more of a central player on the quality front than they've been. Even I can think of one child care administrator that, when I met her 10 years ago, was really all about licensing, and that's all she knew, and that's where she came from. And now she's all about quality. So it varies by state, but it certainly is true that state child care administrators and state human service agencies are playing an even more visible and sometimes more centrally controlling role in driving the quality bus.
Great. The next question is, when talking about building provider engagement with QRIS, how can states build momentum to move from voluntary systems to ones embedded in licensing?
Well, if we had an easy political answer to that question, we'd all be wealthy and politically connected. You know, I think that the move to licensing, excuse me, is really a complicated one, and it's a bit of a risk. I mean, I've talked to providers who've said, you know, I support integrating QRIS with licensing, but I'm worried that the money won't follow. And I agree with that. I think that the track record of states in providing adequate resources is not strong. So I think the lack of trust in the system is somewhat well-founded in a lot of places. But I also think that, you know, if you're going to move from a voluntary system to one that's embedded in licensing, you've got to be really intentional about moving providers right to the center of that conversation. And, you know, licensing confers rights and responsibilities, and so how that plays out and how those rights and responsibilities get exercised in the context of a quality improvement effort and a rating system really need to be something that providers need to weigh in strongly on. I would argue that if we want to get the money that we really need in the system, that we have to play this quality game, and if getting all providers, if moving it into licensing, integrating with licensing is a way to engage all providers, you know, then I'm for it. I don't think that we should be naive about, you know, suddenly money will flow like, you know, like water, but we're definitely not going to get the money without accountability. And so it's definitely a risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking, because eventually, maybe when all of us are retired, we will see states, because of the economic consequences of failing to invest in kids, and because of the school reform and school performance consequences of failing to invest in young kids, I think we will eventually see states and even state legislatures that now we can't even imagine, you know, fully funding a system. I think eventually they will.
Great. So in the interest of time, we're going to take one last question, and if we don't get to your question, we here will work with Gerrit, if that's okay with you, Gerrit, to provide some individual answers, responses.
Sure, and my contact information is in there too, and if you guys want to email me or call me, please feel free.
Okay, great. So the last question here is, on the diversity slide, the last bullet point mentioned financial incentives in Maryland. Can you talk a little bit more about that point?
I can't speak to specific incentives tied to specific benchmarks within the QRIS. What I do know from my conversations with Maryland folks, and they've presented at a couple of their Department of Ed and Human Services folks have presented at a couple of bill meetings, is that they're trying to look very holistically at, they're one of the states, Pennsylvania is another good one, that is looking very holistically at all the different funding streams in the system and how those funding streams can be tied to quality. They're really trying to create meaningful incentives, meaningful steps, if you will, in the system. And so, again, with the caveat that we don't have any illusions that we are at any kind of adequate funding level. You know, Maryland is really trying to, I remember one presentation where the Department of Ed person said, you know, we're trying to look at every dollar that's going out into the early care and education world and to see if we can try to tie that to some kind of quality indicator, both to provide the state with more accountability and to be able to make the case that more money is needed if we really want to get the results that we're seeing. So look on, another thing to do is look on QRISnetwork.org, and you can search under states in the resource library and pull up specific documents that lay out what some of those incentives look like.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gerrit. And we have a couple questions about is this presentation available. On the page where you registered for this webinar, not the go-to webinar URL, but on our website, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel for you to view, and we'll be sending out an email to all the participants with a follow-up link. And if we didn't get to your question, I just want to say again, we will be following up with you and engaging Gerrit to get a response. So thank you all for taking your lunch, and for those on the West Coast, your coffee break, to join us today. And a big thanks to Gerrit for taking his time and giving us this wonderful presentation in our Raise Your Hand series. So with that, everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Thanks, Gerrit.
Thank you.